Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a fascinating lot of sources today, and we're really going to tackle an idea that kind of forces you to look at our own origins in a totally different way.
That's right. It's a pretty radical question we're digging into. What if life here on Earth, didn't just spark up naturally? What if it was, well, intentionally started by some advanced civilization from somewhere else entirely?
Yeah, it's definitely a wild one. And our sources for this, they range from scientific papers looking at, how life might have started here in the first place,
The biogenesis, yeah.
to how it could travel across space, and even some really out there ideas about looking for clues, like in our own DNA.
Mm-hmm. So the goal today is really to unpack all of that, to understand this hypothesis that's called directed panspermia, and just see what the science actually says about it. Is it plausible? What would it mean?
Okay, let's jump in. So first step, setting the scene, the basic puzzle. How did life get started on Earth? A biogenesis life from non-life. It's still one of science's huge question marks.
Absolutely. And we have theories, of course. Good ones.
Right, like the primordial soup idea, that classic image.
Yeah, or life starting near those deep-sea hydrothermal vents, with all that chemical energy.
Yeah.
Or the RNA world hypothesis, the idea that RNA came before DNA.
But none of them are quite definitive.
Not yet. That's the thing. These are all potential pathways, chemically speaking. But researchers, well, they haven't pinned down the exact step-by-step process for how you go from simple non-living molecule
Chemicals.
to something complex, self-replicating, something with metabolism. There's still a gap in our understanding there, as papers like Sutherland's from 2016 point out. It's a really tough problem.
So given that gap and thinking about how tough early Earth conditions might have been, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What if life didn't start here? Because maybe it just couldn't.
And that's exactly the thought that opens the door to this bigger idea, panspermia.
Life from space.
Basically, yeah. The hypothesis that life itself, or maybe just its essential building blocks, arrived on Earth from somewhere else. Hitching a ride on comets or meteorites.
Okay, so it's not necessarily intelligent aliens sending it, just life maybe spreading naturally?
Right, that's the broader concept. And the sources actually break it down a bit. There's lithopanspermia.
Rock seeding.
Kind of, yeah. Tiny life forms, maybe spores, surviving inside rocks, blasted off one planet by an impact, then traveling through space and landing on another.
Wow, okay.
Then there's ballistic panspermia, similar idea, but just within the same solar system. Shorter trip, maybe easier.
Makes sense.
But the one that really pushes the boundaries, and what we're focusing on, is directed panspermia. That's the idea, like Wickramasinghe discussed in 2010, that wasn't an accident. It was intentional. Some intelligence sent life here on purpose.
Okay, that is where my mind starts racing. Deliberate act. And there's a really famous paper connected to this, right, from some major scientists.
Yeah, absolutely. The really foundational paper that gets cited a lot came out in 1973, and it was co-authored by Francis Crick.
Wait, the Francis Crick DNA structure guy?
The very same. And Leslie Orgel, another huge name in origins of life research. They published this paper together, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, life on Earth was deliberately seeded by some advanced extraterrestrial civilization.
Wow. Okay, Crick himself. That gives it some serious weight, even if it sounds like sci-fi. What was their argument? Why did they think this might be plausible?
Well, according to their 73 paper, they had a few key reasons. First, they look at the genetic code. The way DNA spells out instructions for built proteins. It's remarkably universal, basically the same across all life we know. And has these redundancies like multiple DNA words, meaning the same amino acid ingredient.
Okay.
Crick and Orgel felt the way these redundancies were structured seemed almost too neat, too efficient, maybe. It made them wonder if it was, designed somehow, not just a result of random chemical evolution.
Like it was optimized.
Sort of, yeah. Second point, early Earth. It was probably a really nasty place back then. Intense volcanic activity, lots of radiation, maybe not very stable.
Right.
They questioned whether the incredibly delicate first steps of life could really have gotten going and survived in that kind of environment. Maybe it needed a more peaceful nursery.
Okay, that makes sense too. And the third reason?
Just the sheer chemical complexity of DNA itself. It's an incredibly sophisticated molecule. Getting all those atoms arranged just right. They thought maybe it required some advanced chemistry, perhaps something done deliberately, not just relying on what early Earth could cook up by chance.
So let me get this straight. They weren't saying aliens, landed and built dinosaurs.
No, not at all.
It was more like maybe the very first spark, the first replicating molecules or hardy microbes were sent here, perhaps in some kind of probe or vessel.
Exactly. It's about the origin point and the delivery mechanism. Maybe life started somewhere else where conditions were better, or maybe it was even synthesized artificially and then sent out to seed potentially habitable planets like early Earth. It pushes the hardest part, that initial spark, off-world.
That is, yeah, that's a mind tender. It really makes you think. And, okay, if that did happen, is it even possible there'd be any evidence left? Like, could we find some kind of signature, maybe hidden somewhere really deep, like in us?
Well, this is where things get really speculative. You have to understand that. But yes, some researchers have actually proposed exactly that. Could there be patterns hidden in our DNA, things that don't look like they evolved purely naturally?
Like a message.
Yeah.
Or a manufacturer's stamp.
Kind of, like a watermark, yeah. The idea is to look for structures or patterns that seem, well, artificial, non-random in a way that natural selection wouldn't easily explain.
Okay, but what kind of patterns are we talking about? DNA is massively complex. Where would you even look?
Good question. The Scores has mentioned a few possibilities people have kicked around. One is looking again at those coding redundancies Crick and Orgel noted.
The repeated instructions.
Exactly. If the specific way those codes are redundant, the patterns within that redundancy showed some kind of weird mathematical property or sequence that didn't seem functional. Maybe that's a clue.
Okay.
Another idea is looking in the so-called junk DNA. We now know a lot of it does have functions regulating genes and so on.
Right, it's not really junk.
Not mostly, no. But there are still vast stretches whose function isn't clear. Could a signal, some kind of mathematical signature, be embedded there, hidden away?
Like hiding a message in the margins of a book.
Sort of, yeah. And the third place is looking at what are called ultra-conserved genes. These are genes that are so vital, so important, they've barely changed across millions, even hundreds of millions of years of evolution.
Because any change would be lethal, probably.
Exactly. So the idea is if you found strange, non-functional patterns associated with these incredibly stable, critical genes, maybe that's significant. Maybe it was placed there.
It sounds so much like science fiction, but you're saying actual scientists have proposed searching for this stuff.
Yes. There was a paper, I think it was 2013, by Scherback and Makukov. They explicitly talked about looking for genetic code engineering markers.
Engineering markers, wow.
Yeah. They suggested that the very structure of the standard genetic code, the way those codons map to amino acids, might contain non-random mathematical patterns, like a deliberate signature left by whoever or whatever set it up.
So the ultimate message in a bottle, encoded in life itself.
That's the provocative idea, yes. It's definitely way out there, highly theoretical. But it shows how people are trying to think creatively about where evidence could possibly lie if this hypothesis were true.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. Forget looking inside us for a minute. What about looking out there? Is there any evidence from space, just basic astronomical observation, that lends any support to the idea that life's ingredients are floating around?
Oh, absolutely. That part is actually quite solid. Decades of astronomy and space exploration have shown pretty conclusively that the complex organic molecules needed for life as we know it, they're not unique to Earth at all.
Really? So the building blocks are common?
Very common. They're widespread. We found them in lots of places.
Like where?
Well, for example, meteorites. Rocks that fall to Earth from space. The Murchison meteorite is a famous one.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it landed in Australia in '69. Analysis showed it contains dozens of different amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, plus other complex organic stuff like nucleobases, the letters of DNA and RNA.
Amino acids from space falling onto Earth.
Exactly. And then there are comets. The European Space Agency's Rosetta mission, which actually orbited and landed on a comet.
That was amazing.
It really was. It detected complex organic molecules, including an amino acid, right there in the comet's fuzzy atmosphere, its tail.
Wow.
And even further out in the giant clouds of gas and dust between stars where new stars and planets form. Astronomers detect things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs.
PAHs, what are those?
They're basically complex rings of carbon and hydrogen atoms. Think of them as like fundamental bits of soot. But they form the backbone for a lot of more complex organic chemistry. They're everywhere out there.
So the basic ingredients for life, amino acids, organic molecules, are definitely not special to Earth. They're all over the galaxy.
That's the key takeaway. The raw materials are abundant, which makes the idea of transporting life's components, whether it happens naturally, like bits breaking off planets, or intentionally, like in directed panspermia, much more plausible, scientifically speaking. It's not like Earth had some unique magical chemistry kit. The parts are available elsewhere.
Okay, let's pull back and look at the really big picture then. Let's assume for a minute this wild idea, directed panspermia, is actually true, that some ancient aliens did seed life here. What would that actually mean for us? What are the big implications that the sources talk about?
Oh, the implications are huge, just staggering, really. They touch everything from our philosophy, our sense of identity, to maybe even, our future actions as a species.
Okay, unpack that. Identity first. How would it change how we see ourselves?
Well, think about it. Are we then the biological descendants of some ancient, vastly advanced civilization?
Huh?
Are they our creators,
Yeah.
our ancestors, just the ones who started the Petri dish experiment?
Yeah.
It throws all our ideas about human uniqueness, our place in the cosmos, right up in the air. How would that fit with existing religions, ethics, our sense of purpose? Are we just one data point in someone else's grand biological survey of the galaxy?
It would fundamentally shift our entire understanding of history, wouldn't it? Our origin story.
Completely. And then there are the more practical or forward-looking implications the sources mention.
Like what?
Well, if we were seeded, could there be other planets out there? Seeded by the same people, or maybe by others? Are we cosmic siblings with life forms on distant worlds we haven't even conceived of yet?
Could we find them?
Maybe. And then, flipping it around, if reaching a certain stage of advancement means you can spread life, does that imply something about our own future? If humanity survives, if we keep advancing technologically, could we eventually become the cosmic seeders?
Wow. Us sending out probes with bacteria to terraform Mars or seed planets around other stars.
It raises the question, right? Would we have the capability? Would we feel some kind of responsibility or urge to propagate life beyond Earth? It puts our own potential future in a very different light.
So we might not be the end product, but just a step in a much, much longer chain, maybe part of a deliberate, ongoing process spanning the galaxy.
It certainly shifts the perspective, doesn't it? From potentially being a unique, isolated miracle to possibly being part of a vast, maybe even intentional web of life.
Okay, this has been quite a journey for this deep dive. We went from the basic, still unsolved puzzle of abiogenesis, how life started here, through the different flavors of panspermia, landing on this really provocative idea from Crick and Origal back in '73, intentional seeding by aliens.
The directed panspermia.
Right. And we touched on the speculative but fascinating idea of looking for signatures in our own DNA.
The genetic watermark concept.
And also the solid evidence that the basic building blocks of life, organic molecules, are actually incredibly common out there in space.
Yeah, it really pulls together threads from biology, chemistry, astronomy, even philosophy.
It really does. So here's a final thought for you to chew on, something that builds on all this. If, and it's a huge if, obviously, but if an advanced civilization seeded life here, and if they potentially left clues, maybe subtle ones, not just in space dust, but maybe right inside us in our biology, what does that possibility suggest about just how widespread intelligence and life might be out there? And does it mean our own story, the whole human drama, might just be one small part of a much, much larger, maybe even purposeful cosmic biological narrative?
It definitely gives you a whole new way to look up at the stars, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep exploring.